Consider this. It's 1959, and General Motors just built an engine so controversial that dealerships refused to honor warranties if they found out what owners were doing with it. The Pontiac 389 Tri-Power wasn't just an engine. It was a declaration of war against corporate conservatism, and it would transform Pontiac from a grandmother's car company into the most exciting brand in America. The year was 1957. Pontiac was dying. Sales had plummeted to 6th place in the industry, behind even Plymouth. The brand that once competed with Buick was now seen as an old person's car, reliable, boring, and completely forgettable. Seaman Bunky Knudsen had just taken over as general manager with a mandate to either save Pontiac or prepare it for elimination. His solution? Give engineers like Pete Estes and John DeLorean free rein to build something revolutionary. What they created was the 389 cubic inch V8 with triple two-barrel carburetors, the legendary tri-power setup that would become one of the most feared engine combinations in American automotive history. But here's where it gets interesting. The tri-power wasn't supposed to exist at all. General Motors had a corporate ban on multiple carburetors for passenger cars. The official policy stated that only single four-barrel carbs were acceptable for street vehicles. So how did Pontiac engineers get around this? They listed the tri-power as a dealer-installed option, even though the engines were actually assembled at the factory with all three carburetors in place. The paperwork showed it as a single carb engine that just happened to arrive at dealerships with extra parts in the trunk. This wasn't just clever, it was corporate rebellion at its finest. The 389 itself started as a bored and stroked version of Pontiac's 370 cubic inch V8, but calling it just a bigger engine misses the point entirely. The bore was opened up to 4.0625 inches, while the stroke stretched to 3.75 inches, giving exactly 389 cubic inches of displacement. The engine block was specially reinforced with thicker main bearing webs and stronger cylinder walls. Pontiac engineers added a forged steel crankshaft with larger bearing journals, 3 inches for the mains and 2.25 inches for the rods. The connecting rods were forged steel units measuring 6.625 inches center to center. But the real magic happened up top. The cylinder heads were completely redesigned with larger valves, 1.92-inch intakes, and 1.66-inch exhausts. The combustion chambers were reshaped to improve flame propagation, and the ports were enlarged and smoothed for better flow. With the standard single four-barrel carburetor, compression ratio was set at 10.01, but when you ordered the tri-power setup, you got special pistons that bumped compression to 10.75.1. These weren't just any pistons. They were forged aluminum units with a unique dome design that created turbulence in the combustion chamber for more complete burning. The higher compression meant you needed premium fuel, 98 octane minimum, though most racers ran 100-plus octane aviation gas. Now let's talk about those three carburetors. The tri-power setup used 3 Rochester 2GC two-barrel carburetors mounted on a special aluminum intake manifold. The center carburetor was the primary unit, handling all normal driving duties. It had a standard throttle linkage connected directly to the accelerator pedal. The 2 outer carburetors were secondaries, activated by a progressive linkage system that opened them only when you press the pedal past 60% throttle. Combined, these 3 carburetors flowed 860 cubic feet per minute, more than most big 4-barrel carbs of the era. But here's the secret most people don't know. The outer carburetors had no choke plates, no idle circuits, and no accelerator pumps. They were essentially just air valves with main jets. This simplified design reduced weight and eliminated potential failure points. The intake manifold itself was a work of art. Cast from aluminum to reduce weight and improve heat dissipation, it featured equal-length runners to ensure each cylinder received the same amount of fuel mixture. The runners were tuned for a specific RPM range, 3,000 to 5,500 RPM, where the engine made its best power. Pontiac engineers discovered that by making the runners exactly 11 inches long, they could create a resonance effect that actually pushed extra air into the cylinders at peak torque RPM. This natural supercharging effect added about 15 horsepower without any moving parts. In 1959, the base 389 with a single 4-barrel was rated at 260 horsepower. Add the tri-power, and suddenly you had 315 horsepower at 4,800 RPM and 425 pound-feet of torque at 3,200 RPM. But those were gross ratings with no accessories. More importantly, they were conservative. Pontiac deliberately underrated the tri-power engines to avoid insurance problems and corporate scrutiny. Independent dyno tests regularly showed 330 to 340 horsepower at the crank. Some specially tuned versions pushed past 350 horsepower, extraordinary for 1959. The first major application was in the 1959 Pontiac Catalina. With the tri-power 389, a Catalina could run the quarter mile in 14.15 seconds at 98 miles per hour. That made it faster than most Chrysler 392 Hemis and competitive with the vaunted Chevrolet 409. But Pontiac wasn't done. They created the Superduty 389, which took the tri-power concept to extremes. This racing-only version featured forged pistons that pushed compression to 13.1, a wild camshaft with 320 degrees of duration, and special cylinder heads with even larger valves, 2.02-inch intakes, and 1.76-inch exhausts. The Superduty engines were hand-assembled in a special area of the Pontiac engine plant. Each engine took 16 hours to build, compared to 35 minutes for a standard production motor. Every component was individually selected and measured. Pistons were weight-matched to within half a gram. Connecting rods were magnafluxed for cracks and shot-peened for strength. Crankshafts were balanced to racing specifications. The result? 368 horsepower at 5,200 RPM in street trim, or up to 390 horsepower with open headers and racing fuel. But power was only part of the story. The 389 Tri-Power introduced several innovations that would become standard in performance engines. The Rochester fuel injection system that Chevrolet was struggling with? Pontiac engineers studied it and realized that 3 carburetors could deliver similar performance with better reliability and lower cost. The Tri-Power setup cost $434. Expensive, but half the price of fuel injection. It was also field serviceable. Any mechanic who could rebuild a carburetor could work on it. The vacuum-operated secondary system was revolutionary for its time. Instead of mechanical linkage or complex electronics, it used manifold vacuum to determine when the engine needed more fuel. When vacuum dropped below 6 inches of mercury, indicating high load, a diaphragm opened the secondaries progressively. This meant perfect mixture control without any driver input. You just pressed the gas and let physics handle the rest. Heat management was another innovation. The aluminum intake manifold included an exhaust crossover passage that warmed the plenum area for better fuel vaporization during cold starts. But here's the clever part. It had a thermostatic valve that closed off the passage once the engine reached operating temperature, preventing heat soak that would reduce performance. Pontiac also added special heat shields between the manifold and carburetors to prevent percolation in traffic. Let me tell you about the sound. When those secondaries opened, the 389 Tri-Power didn't just accelerate. It announced its presence with a distinctive moan that became known as the Pontiac howl. This wasn't accidental. Engineers deliberately tuned the intake to create this sound by designing the air cleaner housing as a resonance chamber. They discovered that a specific frequency, around 280 Hertz, created psychological excitement in drivers and intimidation in competitors. Marketing loved it. The camshaft was another masterpiece of engineering compromise. The standard Tri-Power cam, known as the 068 grind, offered 288 degrees of duration on the intake and 302 on the exhaust with 0.445 inches lift. This asymmetric profile improved scavenging while maintaining reasonable idle quality. But here's what made it special. The cam was ground with a 4-degree advance built in, which moved the power band down 400 RPM for better street performance. Racers would install it straight up for more top-end power. Pontiac offered 14 different gear ratios for tri-power equipped cars, ranging from 3.2-3.1 for highway cruising to 4.8.1 for drag racing. The most popular was 390.1 with a limited slip differential, the perfect compromise between acceleration and street manners. With this setup, a 1961 Catalina could hit 60 miles per hour in 6.3 seconds and run through the quarter mile in 14.8 seconds at 95 miles per hour. These numbers might not sound impressive today, but in 1961 it was supercar performance from a full-size family sedan. The 389 Tri-Power found its perfect home in the 1964 GTO, the car that created the muscle car segment. The GTO package was actually John DeLorean's way of circumventing another GM policy. Corporate rules limited intermediate cars to 330 cubic inches, but DeLorean discovered a loophole. You could offer larger engines as an option package rather than a model. The GTO was technically a Tempest with an option package that included the 389 Tri-Power, dual exhausts, heavy-duty suspension, and performance tires. GM executives were furious when they discovered what Pontiac had done, but it was too late. The public went crazy for it. That first year, Pontiac expected to sell 5,000 GTOs. They sold 32,450. With the Tri-Power option, code WS for wide spray, the GTO produced 348 horsepower and could embarrass cars costing 3 times as much. Car and driver tested one against a Ferrari GTO. The Pontiac was faster to 100 miles per hour. It cost $3,200. The Ferrari cost $14,000. Here's something most people don't know. There were actually 2 different Tri-Power setups. The street version used Rochester 2GC carburetors with 1.18 75-inch throttle bores. But the over-the-counter racing setup used larger 2GC units with 1.3 125-inch bores and different jetting. These bigger carbs flowed 980 CFM total and were only recommended for engines with at least 11.1 compression and a radical camshaft. Install them on a street engine, and it would bog horribly off the line. The testing process for these engines was insane. Every Tri-Power engine was run on a dynamometer at the factory for 20 minutes at varying loads. If it didn't meet power specifications, it was torn down and rebuilt. Pontiac rejected about 3% of Tri-Power engines during testing, an incredibly high standard for the era. The Superduty engines went through even more rigorous testing, including 2 hours at full throttle on the dyno. If they survived that, they were torn down, inspected, and reassembled with racing gaskets and assembly lube. Now let's talk about the people behind this engine. Pete Estes was the engineering genius who figured out how to get 389 cubic inches from the existing block. Mac McKellar designed the camshaft profiles that gave the Tri-Power its characteristic power curve. But the real unsung hero was Malcolm Mac McKellar. Yes, the same Mac McKellar. He spent 6 months living at the Milford Proving Grounds, sleeping in a trailer, testing different carburetor combinations until he found the perfect setup. His handwritten notes from those tests still exist in the GM Heritage Center. They show he tested 47 different jet combinations before settling on the production specs. The racing success was immediate and overwhelming. In 1960, a Superduty 389 Catalina driven by Jim Wangers won the NHRA Top Stock Eliminator Championship. The car ran 1389 at 103 miles per hour with full exhaust and street tires. By 1961, Superduty Catalinas were running low 13s consistently. Mickey Thompson took one to Bonneville and set a class record at 141 miles per hour. These weren't purpose-built race cars. They were production vehicles anyone could order through their local dealer. The trouble was, you had to know how to order them. The Superduty package wasn't in any brochure. You had to know the special order codes, 544N for the engine, 731K for the aluminum front end, 684P for the special transmission. Dealers didn't even know these codes existed unless they were in Pontiac's racing network. Total production? Just 162 Superduty 389s were built in 1961, 212 in 1962, and 88 in 1963 before GM's racing ban killed the program. That racing ban is another story entirely. In January 1963, GM Chairman Frederick Donner announced that all divisions would immediately cease factory-sponsored racing activities. No more special parts, no more technical support, no more under-the-table development. The official reason was corporate image, but the real reason was fear. The 389 Superduty had become so dominant that other GM divisions complained to corporate. Chevrolet was particularly upset that their expensive mystery motor program was being overshadowed by Pontiac's cheap pushrod engine. But Pontiac engineers didn't give up. They continued development in secret, creating what became known as the XS Code 389. This was essentially a Superduty engine disguised as a regular production option. It had the forged pistons, the big valve heads, and the radical cam, but with slightly lower compression to meet emissions requirements. Only 246 were built before GM auditors discovered the program and shut it down. Today, an XS Code 389 is worth more than most people's houses. The street versions kept evolving too. In 1965, Pontiac bored the 389 out to 4.09375 inches to create the 400 cubic inch version, but the tri-power setup remained largely unchanged. The last year for factory tri-power was 1966, killed by tightening emissions regulations and insurance company pressure. In its final form, the 400 tri-power was rated at 360 horsepower, though actual output was closer to 380. It remains one of the highest specific output naturally aspirated engines of the muscle car era, 0.95 horsepower per cubic inch. The cost of all this performance? In 1964, the tri-power option added $115 to the base GTO price. Adjusting for inflation, that's about $100 to $100 today. A bargain for 63 extra horsepower. But the real cost came at the gas pump. A tri-power GTO got about 8 miles per gallon in city driving, 12 on the highway if you kept your foot out of it, which nobody did. The maintenance requirements were surprisingly reasonable. The carburetors needed synchronization every 5,000 miles, which took a skilled mechanic about an hour. The special high-performance valves required adjustment every 3,000 miles. And those forged pistons? They were so strong that engines regularly went 100,000 miles without a rebuild, unheard of for a high-performance engine in the 1960s. Let me give you some perspective on what this engine meant. Before the 389 tri-power, performance cars were expensive, exotic machines from Italy or England. After it, any working-class American could walk into a Pontiac dealer and buy world-class performance off the showroom floor. It democratized speed in a way that changed car culture forever. The influence extended far beyond Pontiac. Chrysler developed their six-pack setup, 3 two-barrel carbs on their 440 and 340 engines, as a direct response to tri-power. Ford created their triple-carb 427 Cammer. Even Oldsmobile, the conservative engineering division, developed the W30 triple-carb setup for their 442. None would have existed without Pontiac showing it could be done reliably on a mass production scale. Today, original tri-power setups are incredibly valuable. A complete correct intake and carburetor setup sells for $8,000 to $12,000. NOS carburetors can fetch $2,000 each. But here's the thing. Reproductions are so good now that even experts struggle to tell them apart from originals. The aftermarket has reverse-engineered every component down to the correct zinc plating on the linkage rods. Finding an original unmolested 389 tri-power engine is like finding buried treasure. Most were raced, modified, blown up, and rebuilt multiple times. Pontiac historians estimate that fewer than 500 complete, numbers-matching Superduty engines survive. A documented Superduty Catalina recently sold at auction for $385,000. Not bad for a car that listed for $3,400 new. The technical legacy lives on in modern engines. That tuned length intake manifold concept? It's in every modern performance engine, just with variable runner technology. The vacuum-operated secondary system evolved into modern drive-by-wire throttle control. Even the idea of underrating horsepower for insurance purposes continues today. Just ask any owner of a BMW M car or a Dodge Hellcat about their real dyno numbers. But perhaps the greatest legacy is cultural. The 389 Tri-Power proved that American engineers could build world-class performance engines without overhead cams, fuel injection, or exotic materials. It was pure hot rod engineering. Take a basic design and optimize every component until it sings. That philosophy created the muscle car era and continues to influence American performance cars today. There's one last secret about the 389 Tri-Power that even most Pontiac experts don't know. In 1962, Pontiac built exactly 12 engines with an experimental aluminum block. These weren't just aluminum copies of the iron block. They were completely redesigned with cross-bolted mains, priority main oiling, and provisions for dry sump lubrication. They weighed 85 pounds less than the iron version and could safely rev to 7,500 RPM. All 12 were supposedly destroyed after testing, but rumors persist that at least 2 survived and are hidden in private collections. The end came suddenly. On December 15, 1966, GM's executive committee voted to ban multiple carburation on all passenger cars effective immediately. The official reason was emissions compliance, but internal memos reveal the real reason. Insurance companies were threatening to refuse coverage for cars with multiple carburetors. The Tri-Power's reputation had become its downfall. It was simply too successful at what it did. John DeLorean later called the death of Tri-Power the beginning of the end for real performance at GM. He was right. While engines got bigger in the late 1960s, they never again achieved the specific output or visceral excitement of the Tri-Power combinations. The 455 duty that followed was powerful, but it was a brute force solution. The 389 Tri-Power was engineering elegance. Think about this for a moment. In an era before computer modeling, flow benches, or modern metallurgy, a group of engineers in Pontiac, Michigan, created an engine that could compete with anything in the world. They did it with slide rules, intuition, and thousands of hours of cut-and-try testing. They fought corporate bureaucracy, insurance companies, and NASCAR rules makers, and they won, at least for a while. The 389 Tri-Power wasn't just an engine, it was a statement of intent. It said that Pontiac refused to build boring cars, refused to follow the safe path, refused to let accountants and lawyers determine what enthusiasts could buy. Every time those 3 carburetors opened up and that distinctive howl filled the air, it was a middle finger to mediocrity. Modern engines are faster, more efficient, more reliable. A basic Camaro SS would destroy any 389 Tri-Power car in any performance metric. But numbers don't tell the whole story. There was something magical about twisting 3 carburetors wide open, feeling the secondaries kick in, that mechanical symphony of valves and pistons and gears working in perfect harmony. It was analog performance in its purest form. No computers, no safety nets, just you and 389 cubic inches of American thunder. Today's engineers work under constraints the Pontiac team couldn't have imagined. Emissions regulations, safety requirements, corporate average fuel economy standards. But the spirit of the 389 Tri-Power lives on every time an engineer finds a creative solution to an impossible problem, every time someone figures out how to make a car faster, despite the rules saying it can't be done. The last running Superduty 389 crossed the auction block at Mecum last year. It sold for $451,000 to a collector who promised to race it at least once a year. That's fitting. These engines weren't built to sit in museums. They were built to run, to win, to prove that engineering excellence and corporate rebellion could coexist in 389 cubic inches of cast iron and aluminum. So the next time you see a modern performance car with its turbos and computers and traction control, remember where it all started. Remember the engineers who risked their careers to build something extraordinary. Remember the 389 Tri-Power, the engine that saved Pontiac, created the muscle car era, and proved that sometimes more really is more. What's the wildest engine combination you've ever experienced? Drop a comment below and share your story. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most important engines in American history, hit that subscribe button for more legendary engineering stories. Until next time, keep those carburetors synchronized and those valves adjusted.